are now recording. We're broadcasting via Facebook Live. So we'll go ahead and then start the talk. My name is William Burg. I'm a historian. This is not my job. Sacramento history is a hobby, one that I did turn into a career as a historian, but I'm doing this on my own time. I'm not affiliated with any museum, archive, library, or anything like that. I'm doing it on my own. The photos that you're going to see mostly come from the Center for Sacramento History, which I've used with permission in my books on Sacramento, as well as some from the California State Library and some that I stumbled across the Sacramento room of the Sacramento Public Library, and a few other sources, in some cases private collections. And a lot of the material from this talk is from my fourth book, Sacramento's K Street. Now, the subject matter that we're going to discuss today is Black history in Sacramento from roughly the gold rush to the 1870s. And one question that I want to address right off the bat is, why is a white guy talking about Black history? And the simplest response from my perspective, a very limited white man's perspective, is because it's really interesting. And if you are a gold miner, you don't go gold mining where everybody else has already dug. You look for new streams, new sources. And the history of Sacramento's underrepresented communities, while not unexplored, has a lot more material worth exploring and worth sharing. A lot of the work that some of what you're going to hear today is from other historians who have done this in great depth. In two cases, Clarence Caesar, whose master's thesis about Sacramento's African-American history is one of the fundamental works on the subject in this city. It has never been published, unfortunately. There are a few excerpts that were put into articles and into displays. Clarence is still working as a volunteer with the Sacramento History Alliance, so he's contributing to things like Sacramento's History Museum. But a lot of Sacramento's Black history goes underreported. And so when people start talking about Sacramento history, the first thing begins and ends at John Sutter, at the Gold Rush, and the Transcontinental Railroad, and the handful of white men principally that are involved with that. And I'm not that interested in their history. Not that I'm not at all. Some cases they're interesting. Some of them are going to be in this presentation, but we don't know enough about the people whose names haven't been recorded in history books other than relatively small press or limited release ones. Another historian whose work has influenced me greatly is Salome Baptist, and she has studied some significant figures in California African-American history. We'll talk about some of them later. Mary Ellen Pleasant and the Heyer sisters. I really encourage you to look into some of the work that she's done. There's several documentaries on the Heyer sisters and Mary Ellen Pleasant that she has authored and acted in and written, and they are really worth your time. And other reason why I want to talk about Black history, like I said, is because it is inseparable from Sacramento's history. The common threads, the stuff that we learn about, if you grew up in Sacramento, you went on the same trips to Sutter's Fort, to the Railroad Museum, and you only got a certain portion of the story, obviously by time limitations or space limitations, but often it is limitations of hegemony. That the story that we hear growing up and in school, or even reported about in newspapers as this is a subject that is appropriate for the study of Sacramento history, only comes from a certain perspective, generally a white male perspective. Well, that's also my perspective, and I cannot do history from a Black perspective. Wherever possible, I try, number one, to quote my sources, to talk about the people who brought these ideas, and wherever I can, speak in people's own words, using quotes, autobiographies, narratives, oral histories. And the source documents that you're looking for, in the case of Clarence Caesar's master's thesis, it's currently, I think the only place you can find it is in the basement of Sacramento State in their master's thesis index. A lot of it is online now, so some of it may be searchable and findable, but all of this is out there. And then the Center for Sacramento History, which I also already mentioned is one of the sources of my photos, and the Sacramento room of the Sacramento Public Library. but we're going to start. Let me switch over to our presentation. And I want to start before California became part of the United States during the Mexican era. And Clarence Caesar, who I mentioned, wrote about some of the very earliest black men to come to California before it was part of the United States. One that I really didn't know much about until not too long ago is Peter Rand. And he came as part of Jedediah Smith's expedition that located the American River. And we don't know much about him other than his name. He was black and he was a member of the Jedediah Smith Company. Another name, George Washington, all we literally know is the name. We really don't know for sure whether or not he was black. There's the assumption that was made in Clarence Caesar's thesis that he was. That's all we know. And then another person whose name we don't know is a barrel maker at Sutter's Fort, who was unidentified other than that he was black and he worked at Sutter's Fort, is kind of a blank space. And that's really, in a lot of cases, the challenges of studying this kind of history, is because we just don't know much about people who weren't able to make that much of a splash on history outside of very limited space. To working people, working class people, generally they don't get a whole lot into the record. But we do know about a couple, and these are two very significant individuals. And on the left is all right. And I've just been told I'm not sharing the screen, so you can't see what I'm looking at. So let me try that once more. Can you see my screen now? Thank you. All right, on the left, that's Jim Beckworth. If any of you have traveled through Beckworth Pass, he discovered it. He was a mountain man, a pathfinder, and fairly pivotal figure in California during this period before the Mexican War. He stopped for a while in Sacramento to become a professional gambler after the war, but he was a traveler, and so he never stayed in one place for long. But while he didn't stay for a great length of time, his impact was definitely felt. On the right is William Leidesdorff, and he arrived in California from the West Indies, and he was the son of a Danish landowner and West Indian mother. It was believed either born on St. Croix or St. Thomas Island, both part of the Virgin Islands chain, in 1810. And very little is known about his early years, but he was, so far as we know, an illegitimate child. By Danish law, was given the rights and privileges inherent in Danish citizenship, including an education. So he was mixed race within the context of 19th century North America, passing for white. And he came to the United States in the 1830s. By 1834, he was in New Orleans. He inherited his father's estate in 1837. He became a United States citizen. And one thing about this that is a bit unique is that John Sutter, people generally assume that he was an American citizen before he was a Mexican citizen and then became an American citizen again. But that's not how it worked. Leidesdorff had American citizenship first, then he went to Mexico, California, received a land grant, Rio de los Americanos, just east of Sutter's grant, in roughly the area of its Rancho Cordova, Folsom, the eastern part of Sacramento County, and also established business in San Francisco. So his base of operations was San Francisco, and his rancho was on the far side of Sacramento. One attribute of that is he started that connection to the west, where his base was in San Francisco and his investments, his land for cattle ranching ostensibly, was to the east in Sacramento, whereas Sutter was based in Sacramento and he was oriented eastward. He was very involved with welcoming settlers from the United States, in some cases illegal settlers. The Mexican government really didn't appreciate a great deal of immigration from the United States, but they couldn't really stop him. The Leidesdorf also became consul after the with the United States. So he was a liaison between the government of the United States and the government of Mexico prior to the Mexican War. And he died in 1848, just before the gold rush. If he had not, he would have become a spectacularly rich man, because, as we know, gold was discovered on the American River running right through his rancho. And instead of the city being named after Leidesdorf, it was named after Joseph Folsom, who got the land after him. Next person I want to talk about, if I could find his narrative here in my notes, is James Williams. And he was born in slavery, got away when he was about 13, and became an adventurer, had many travels around the country, and spent a lot of time in and around Sacramento between the gold rush and the 1870s. And he showed up in Sacramento at first to mine for gold. Let me find his narrative so I can read some of what he said. This is from The Life and Adventures of James Williams, a Fugitive Slave. And I highly recommend it. You can find it for free online. Just search for James Williams, Sacramento, and it'll pop up pretty quickly. On the 15th day of May, 1851, you've learned that I arrived in the city of Sacramento. You have also learned that I worked in the gold mines. And I will not repeat the name of the location of those gold mines. But I worked there about 6 months, and seeing nothing could be made there, I left and went to Kelsey's diggings. I worked there about 3 months, nothing, and with no better success. I then returned to the city of Sacramento. I there commenced carrying the hod. He was principally a plaster worker through most of his career, which I did for 3 months at $6 per day. After which I brought out the goodwill and fixtures of a large restaurant and kept it for the entertainment of the whites. Be it known that about that time there were a number of slaves brought to California by their masters, one of which was a woman brought there by her master, who would not allow one man or men to go to his house. But I went there, taking a white man with me at the time, and took her away. In a few days her master comes to my establishment, bringing with him an officer, who presented a pistol at me, and saying at the time, "Williams, you must go and get that woman you stole from Mr. Holman, or I will blow your brains out." "Very good, sir," says I. "Come on." I'm leading the way. Taking him directly to an attorney, Zabriskie's office, I alleged my complaint against him for pointing a six-shooter at me, and he was held for trial, which was given in my favor. Of course, I retained her, and 1 week this woman left and went back to her master, telling him that I threatened to shoot him. His party getting after me caused me to leave there, and on the boat flying between Sacramento and San Francisco, I was attacked by a party of Missourians and beaten very badly, and had to be rescued by the captain after having run to the ladies' saloon. Now, Williams returned to Sacramento in 1855, seeking work on the Sacramento levee, which was being reinforced because by then they had had several serious floods. And whites resisted basically his right to work as levee labor, and filed suit and fought, saying, "Well, we don't want him to work here." But Williams won the right for black men to work on the levee. And he didn't stay for long. He went to work at the Southern Mines and returned to Sacramento again in 1856 and kept a junk store for a while. And he went on there to ride an express wagon. But Williams is an interesting character because he's just got nerves of steel. And there are several situations in his biography where he's being faced down. He doesn't blink, he doesn't flinch, he acts with deliberation, but also with speed. And Zabriskie, if any of you have heard the term Poverty Ridge, the hill that's around 21st Street in Midtown Sacramento, that was originally named Zabriskie Ridge. And Zabriskie was an attorney who, at least from this account, could be accounted to listen to a black miner who walked in and sought his help, and successfully did so. So he's kind of the first, I guess you could call him an ally that we encounter. We'll talk about more allies and such in a little while. But the main thing, the lesson that I learned from studying James Williams is this is someone with agency. Black people in California were not rescued. They were not lifted up by whites who sought their freedom for them. They took control of their situation in whatever limited fashion they could and fought for their survival, for their rights, for their liberation. And that agency is a pretty interesting subject because there was so much arrayed against them. White Californians, for the most part, were separated into two groups: those who believed that California, or at least a portion of it, should be a slave state, and those who opposed slavery, not because of any moral opposition to black people being enslaved, but because they didn't want black people in the state of California. And the perfect example of that on the left is Peter Burnett, California's first governor. He was born in Nashville, and he made his money in California pretty fast, not mining, but selling lots of Sacramento on behalf of John Sutter Jr. And he was appointed by John Fremont and William Gwynn as a state senator. And he, like I said, he opposed slavery, and he signed what was called the foreign miners tax, which banned people who, in principally Chinese and Mexican miners, from mining in California without paying a steep fee. In the middle is John Bigler. He was elected in 1852. He was the one who moved the capital to Sacramento, then to Benicia, then back to Sacramento. He was originally what was called a Free Soil Democrat. The Democratic Party was split into two factions at this point: Free Soilers, which opposed slavery, and the Chivalry Democrats, which supported slavery. But during the Civil War, he expressed Southern sympathies, and that led to a lake right on the California and Nevada border, Bigler Lake, being renamed. And you may not be familiar with a lake called Bigler Lake there because it's now Lake Tahoe. So there's a fairly early precedent of someone losing their name on a public feature or a geographic feature because their racial politics were not in tune with the times. To the right is J. Neely Johnson, still the youngest governor of California at 30, and the only representative of what was called the Native American Party, or the Know Nothing Party. It's kind of an interesting character in that he once vetoed a bill because the spelling was bad. But the Native American Party, or Know Nothing Party, was founded by Sam Roberts in San Francisco in 1854. It was a national party. They opposed immigration. They were primarily an anti-immigrant group, and they opposed Irish, German, Chinese immigration. They were also very much anti-Catholic. And a state Supreme Court judge who was a party member ruled that no Chinese person could testify as a witness against a white man in court. And this law was later expanded. So if you were not white, you couldn't testify in court at all. And that became one of the major issues for Black Sacramentans in the coming years. Now, their party became divided over slavery in 1856, but this shows you the type of gents who were California's first governors and the positions they held regarding Black Californians. Now, this is a map of Sacramento. I'm going to try to point to some things here. Now, this was from about the 1860s, but generally this is 31st Street, now Alhambra Boulevard. This is Y Street, now Broadway. This swampy area here is what is now the Southern Pacific Shops. We actually moved the river farther north. But these dots that you see here, this is all from Clarence Caesar's thesis, by the way, are where the African-American population was located. And principally that was towards the river, between about R Street, where the levee was, and downtown. And geographically, as you move farther east, the population was less and less black. So you get a sense of sort of on a map where parts of town we're talking about, because there was at this point a black community that was getting established very rapidly within about 4 or 5 years, and they were all within a very small neighborhood, roughly where Capitol Mall and Interstate 5 is today. And as mentioned in James Williams' testimony, even though California was nominally a free state, if you were a sojourner, you were passing through and you had slaves, you didn't necessarily have to give them up. So there were human beings enslaved in California and in Sacramento. I mentioned the Civil Practices Act in 1851. That's why testimony by anyone who wasn't white was banned. And the Fugitive Slave Law in 1852, which made crossing over state lines as an escaped slave meant you had to go back, and this meant that there were slave catchers working in California, working in Sacramento. We're going to hear about some of that too. Slaves were advertised for sale. In this case, the master said, "Well, I'll sell them for $300, but I'll also sell them to someone who wants to free him if you dare to do so, and are willing to give me money for it." So he's challenging the anti-slavery advocates who were already present in California, both black and white, to pay him to free somebody. And in some cases that happened. In other cases it was done through other means. The black community in Sacramento already had early leaders by the mid 1850s who had emerged, who'd come to California for various reasons. And pardon me, I'll get my notes together. On the left is Daniel Blue, and he was one of the founders of St. Andrew's African Methodist Episcopal Church. He lived in what's now Alkali Flat on F Street, and he lived directly across the street from the first governor of California that I mentioned, the guy who didn't want black people to be in the state. Kind of probably was a little uncomfortable if there was a neighborhood potluck. They probably weren't too friendly with each other. But Daniel Blue didn't mind that at all and didn't mind challenging the established order. In the middle is Elizabeth Thorne Scott Flood. And in the early 1850s, she started the first school for black children and also for Indian children in California. She was born in 1828. Educated in New Bedford, came west with her husband Joseph Scott during the gold rush. Joseph died in Placerville, so Elizabeth and her son moved to Sacramento in the early 1850s, but her son was not allowed to enter the public school. She opened a private school at 4th and K for black and Indian children, and it was based out of her home. She also had Chinese students. The school board technically, at least nominally, made her part of the school system, but segregated and unfunded. So she became the first African-American public school instructor in California. She married Isaac Flood in 1855 and moved to a community called Brooklyn outside of Oakland. And she founded another school there in 1857. To the right is J.B. Sanderson. He took over Ms. Flood's school and relocated it to St. Andrew's AMA Church, started by Daniel Blue in 1855. He appealed to Sacramento City Council that this was a public school, it was part of the public school system and deserved public funding. The city council at the time, the city alderman, agreed and voted in favor of it, but Mayor English at the time vetoed that support. And he said he felt it would be particularly obnoxious to those of our citizens who have immigrated from southern states. The council at the time overturned that vote. And the key vote was a businessman by the name of Mark Hopkins, who we'll hear a little more about later. But it shows a changing sentiment. While there's definitely still some Southern sympathy going on, there is also a lot of abolitionist sentiment in the city of Sacramento that's starting to grow along with the black community, which, while small, had a very loud voice and were really kind of caught in the middle of the politics of the day. I think some people are asking questions, so I'm going to drop out of the presentation for a moment and I want to take a look at the chat screen. Okay, I guess my volume is really low, so let me see if I can change my audio settings a little bit. Okay, this is about as loud as I can get, I'm afraid. All right. So in response to the laws that were being passed that limited the rights of anybody in California who wasn't white, St. Andrew's AME started a petition to repeal that testimony statute. And they held a series of statewide conventions here in Sacramento in order to establish not only the positions of the Black community in California, but their policies and what should be done about it. And these conventions were more than just one-time events. They actually became institutions in themselves, in some cases armed institutions. More about that later. The first convention took place at St. Andrews AME, and they appealed to the city council. Sorry, I lost my place. The first convention took place on November 20th, 1855 at St. Andrews AME, and it was opened by J.B. Sanderson. 28 of the 49 delegates were from Sacramento or San Francisco, the rest coming from the mining counties. Southern California was very sparsely populated at this point. Los Angeles was maybe 1,500 people, about 500 people in San Diego. So it was principally Northern California. Equal right of testimony was the most critical issue, equal protection of law. Anti-slavery was downplayed at first. It was obviously an issue, but they were concerned about white reaction if too much noise about the issue of slavery was made. An appeal was made by one committee for Black migrants to California to focus on agriculture instead of mining. Even by 1855, the gold rush was starting to slow down a bit. There wasn't as much placer mining, but there was becoming a desperate need for food. And California agriculture was in its infancy. William Leidesdorff had started some of that institution in the land around Folsom, but it still needed continuing. And I was contacted actually before this by a member of a family of Black farmers who probably settled in what's now El Dorado County at about this time. I didn't have time to include them in this presentation, and I wanted to limit the scope to Sacramento. But there were also, in addition to the community here in the city, there were also regional Black communities that were more involved in farming and resource extraction, but Sacramento was the hub of the state when it came to transportation and goods. So they ran through here. And very often we find that in immigrant and migrant communities, there's a city group and a country group that are economically dependent on each other. And they came together at these conventions. The second convention was held at December 9th, 1856, and it was held at a place called Hackett House, which was a hotel around 3rd and L Street, currently under Interstate 5, that was very central in organizing and political activism in Black Sacramento. Black-owned business, Black-owned hotel. And December 9th, 1856, for a year, the convention had been gathering signatures for the right to testify, but it was sitting buried in legislative committees at the state capitol. Education was the other priority for the 1856 convention. One resolution caused a lot of consternation: that we claim our rights in this country as any other class, not as citizens by adoption, but by the right of birth, that we hail with delight its onward progress, sympathize with it in its adversity, and would freely cast our lot in the fortunes of battle to protect her against foreign invasion. Essentially, they're saying Black men are willing to fight for this country in a military conflict. Delegate William Newby, editor of California's first African American weekly, Mirror of the Times of 1857, wrote that the rights must come first before his people's willingness to fight. I would hail the advent of a foreign army upon our shores if that army provided liberty to me and my people in bondage. This debate ended up scuttling the resolution. There was conflict there over whether or not it was right for a Black man to fight for the Army of the United States, which held his brethren in chains. That obviously came to a head just a few years later with the coming of the Civil War and Black soldiers fighting for the Union Army. The 1854 Democratic Convention in Sacramento was held at 4th Street Baptist Church. You can see him on the left here. And David Broderick and David Terry, David Broderick on the right, Terry on the left, both with some spectacular beards, were representative of the split between the chivalry branch, the pro-slavery faction, and the Free Soil or Tammany branch, the anti-slavery faction. The chivalry wing resigned the party. And, on the left, that's David Terry was part of the chivalry wing. and on the right, David Broderick, who represented the Free Soilers. This split between the Democratic Party opened up an opportunity for a new political party called the Republicans, which were largely based on an anti-slavery platform. And a lot of you, if you've been to, if you grew up in Sacramento, you've probably seen these four guys before. Charlie Crocker, Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, who I mentioned was the guy who overrode the mayor about funding the black school, and Collis P. Huntington, who I really believe was the inspiration for the Simpsons character Montgomery Burns. He's the archetypal greedy business guy. The others had plenty of their own flaws as well. Charlie Crocker's brother, Edwin Bryant Crocker, on the left here, also with a spectacular beard, was an active, before he became involved in railroading, he was actually involved in the Underground Railroad on the East Coast. And the 1856 Republican Party convention, which was held in this congregational church on 6th between I and J, was the beginning of the California Republican Party. And there was a disturbance raised by a group described in the newspaper as Americans. And I assume by Americans, they mean the Native Americans, the Native American Party, the Know Nothing Party that we talked about earlier under Governor Janie Lee Johnson, who they really didn't like this anti-slavery party coming to California, and they pelted them with rotten eggs and firecrackers. And the candidate put forth by this new Republican Party was John C. Fremont. Now, a word about allies and abolitionists in the 1850s. Someone who was an abolitionist in the 1850s was not necessarily someone who supported the idea of black liberation and black equality. They may have some who would really have been radicals within that group, perhaps, but for the most part, when a white person described themselves as an abolitionist, they saw themselves still in a superior position over the black community, that black people were not deserving of slavery, but lesser than white people. And it was the obligation of the white people to raise up their lesser brethren in that manner, which is a paternalistic position. It is often a harmful and toxic position, and superior only over that of slavery. But these were, in essence, about the only allies the black community had, and they made use of those alliances as best they could, again, with the objective of obtaining their rights, of being heard, of having their freedom not given to them, but secured through their own efforts. Now, Colonel Fremont was a popular military and political figure after the Mexican War, especially in California. And California as a new state, the first time that the Californians had an influence on national politics. Here's the political map of the United States. You can see all the free states are in the upper right-hand corner, except for California. And then there's a whole bunch of unclaimed territories that aren't states yet, and then slave states in the lower right. So California definitely stands out. And for a small state, or a massive state with a tiny population, California definitely punched above its weight class. This is how the Republican Party was characterized. And you hear plenty about, oh, the Republicans were the ones who were anti-slavery. The Republican Party of the 1850s was very, very different from the one we have today. And this was the kind of the cast of characters that was associated with Republican politics. Vegetarians, feminists. You see the young woman there smoking a pipe and wearing pants. Poor people who wanted redistribution of property, essentially early socialists. Those who wanted to dissolve marriage and basically share in free love. Essentially, the opposition to the Republicans felt like they were trying to dissolve traditional family values. And then Catholics. We talked a little bit about anti-Catholics among the Native American Party. And this was because at the time, the Catholic Church, for the most part, was considered a strange foreign church that owed its allegiance to the Pope in Europe rather than to the government of the United States. So in a lot of cases, anti-Catholics, activists, that anti-Catholics were, they thought of the Catholic Church the same way that prejudiced folk in this century think of Muslims, as a foreign influence that would change the American way of life by introducing a strange new religion. And of course, the Black community, represented by the Republicans in their anti-slavery platform, were also ridiculed and stereotyped in materials of this sort, which the whole idea is to make the case that the Republicans are a bunch of radical liberals, lefties, and this crew is who supports them. Well, as it turns out, that support had a lot of backing, but Fremont lost. Next, we're going to talk about Archie Lee. I will find my place in my notes, and we'll continue. Okay, now Archie Lee came to Sacramento in October of 1857 with Charles Stovall from Mississippi. Archie Lee came as property. Charles Stovall came and established a school in Sacramento, which theoretically you weren't supposed to do. Again, you could travel through California with your slave, but if you were a sojourner, you're just passing through. But if you stayed, you had to liberate them, you had to free them. And when Stovall started hiring Archie out to do work for him, he stumbled across the Hackett House, which I mentioned was that center of Black organizing at 3rd and L Street. And they said, you know, you've got some rights here. And so when Stovall decided to leave California, Archie said no. And the January of 1858, he said it more forcefully, and Archie was arrested for refusing to leave by Sacramento County Sheriff. Shortly after Archie's arrest, Charles Parker of Hackett House approached Edwin Crocker's law firm to defend Archie. And Crocker and his partner John McCain accepted the case. However, the decision of Judge Robert Robinson on January 26, 1858 was that Archie was a free man because Stovall was a permanent resident of California and thus couldn't own slaves. Stovall arranged for a second arrest warrant by appealing to state Supreme Court, and Lee found himself before another judge. In 1858, California's Supreme Court was located in the Jansen Building at 4th and J Street, just over a block from Hackett House. And the state Supreme Court justice at the time was Peter Burnett, that first governor of California, and the guy who wanted California to be free of Black people entirely. He had actually gotten a law passed in Oregon before it became a state that said if you were Black and lived in Oregon, if you wanted to stay, you basically had to submit yourself to a public beating every few months. So, real charmer. And he said, you know, I feel sorry for poor Mr. Stovall. He didn't realize all laws, so we're going to show sympathy towards him and let him take Archie and go out of California. Again, charming guy. While a member of the Oregon legislature, on February 1858, Judge Burnett handed down that decision, supported by Supreme Court Justice David Terry, who again is that chivalry Democrat who got into an argument with David Broderick a few years earlier, and they were hoping that they were going to go on their way. But most Californians, especially in the African-American communities, were outraged by the absurdity of this decision. And on March 5th, Stovall tried to sneak Lee out of California on a ship called the Orizaba, but he was stopped by representatives of that statewide Black convention. And our friend James Williams, again, that adventurer that I talked about with the nerves of steel, he was there with an armed party of Black men who took Archie Lee off of the Orizaba, and his troubles weren't over yet. There were still 2 more trials he had to go through, and they had hoped that William Penn Johnston, a Southerner, argued that Lee was in violation of the National Fugitive Slave Law. They hoped that Johnston's status as a federal official would trump the California state law. but Lee's San Francisco attorney, Edwin Baker, argued that since Lee attempted to escape Stovall's bondage while in California, no state lines were crossed and thus no federal case could be established. Johnston agreed, and on April 14, 1858, Archie Lee was declared a free man. Lee joined an expedition of African Americans resettling in Victoria, British Columbia, but he later returned to California. In 1873, several newspapers in San Francisco and Sacramento reported that Lee was found ill near the bank of the American River and was taken to the county hospital, where he died. Lee's victory created a legal precedent that helped others escape slavery and promoted the abolitionist cause in Sacramento via institutions like Hackett House and anti-slavery attorneys like Charles Broderick. Also, behind part of this was Mary Pleasant. She was originally had come from Louisiana, from New Orleans, where she studied under Marie Laveau. She established herself as San Francisco and became a very rich woman, very richest African American women in the 19th century, in California certainly, if not the United States. And supposedly her money and influence were part of what facilitated the Black Convention to be able to have the funds and resources to liberate Archie. Again, I mentioned Cecile Bibbs and her work in the story of Mary Pleasant, highly worth looking into. Now, we talked about David Broderick and David Terry, and they had started out as friends. They were both fairly fantastic night fighters and brawlers, but on September 13th, 1859, they had been divided by the issue of section and of slavery, and David Terry lost his re-election bid to the state Supreme Court and blamed Broderick. And so they met at Lake Merced outside of San Francisco and decided they were going to have a duel to the death. Broderick's pistol fired early. Terry shot Broderick in the lung. Broderick died 3 days later. So Broderick, as a anti-slavery activist, was willing to defend those principles with his life, and he lost his life for it. Broderick became a symbol of martyrdom, of the cause of abolition, and one of the many forces that converged to give California to Abraham Lincoln, who then became president, the first Republican president, setting off the Civil War. California came in as a free state. There's a monument in Capitol Park to David Starr King for his efforts to keep California in the Union, because there were some efforts to split California away. We were located thousands of miles away from the rest of the country. You saw how remote we were through all these not yet states territories. But there was also part maybe because of geography, maybe because of settlement, and maybe because of the activism of the Black community, and they're showing their value to the people of California that tilted things in the direction of union. And another major project of the Civil War era in California was the establishment of the Central Pacific Railroad in order to connect that remote, distant California to the rest of the country. And guess what? The 4 businessmen who won that contract were the same 4 people who started the California Republican Party and helped get Lincoln the presidency. So they broke ground in 1862 while people were actively shooting each other, and built the railroad during this period, HighSpeed Rail, a massive federal project. And because so much of the American public was shooting at each other, they needed to bring in thousands of Chinese workers in order to do that work. And that meant there was a large influx of another non-white population, which was already present for the gold rush, but became a much larger factor. And thus the rights of communities of color in California had to come to a head. And in 1863, emancipation in California and testimony, the right to testify, were initially approved. Find my place again. This, by the way, is the second church, the Black church in Sacramento, Salome Baptist. Now it's known as Shiloh Baptist, but originally it was Salome. They originally met at 6th and 8th Street in formerly a Chinese Baptist church. There was a third statewide convention which was held in San Francisco. But as I said, in 1863, testimony laws were revised. White lawmakers slowly repealed restrictions, but most still considered California a white man's government. The Republican legislature, led by Senator Richard F. Perkins of San Francisco, passed the Perkins Act of 1863, which called for repeal of anti-black testimony statutes. The convention executive committee passed a resolution of thanksgiving for their hard-earned victory. The Pacific Appeal, an African-American newspaper printed after closure of Mirror of the Times, printed the resolution on March 21st, 1863. Chinese were still excluded from the benefits of the Perkins Bill until 1873, a decade later. Now, there was a fourth colored convention held in Sacramento in 1865, focusing on issues of education and suffrage. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, which gave the right to vote to all males, but women still couldn't vote, of course. But continued opposition in California was based on fear that the Chinese would get the vote, which they mentioned they didn't get until 1873. Governor Henry Haight tried to reject the 15th Amendment in principle, and some rural counties tried to bar non-whites. But county clerks in Sacramento and San Francisco announced that all citizens could register to vote, regardless of color. The workaround, the racist workaround in this case, for Chinese was declaring that Chinese, and in some cases other Asian immigrants that came later, were residents ineligible for citizenship. Black voters were not, and so their right to vote had been assured by this, at least in theory. April 4th, 1870 was declared a day of celebration in Sacramento, and the community celebrated by marching down 5th Street in a 3-block procession from St. Andrew's AME to Salome Baptist Church. So in the 1870s, things are looking a little sunnier. Sacramento has a new African-American teacher, Sarah Mildred Jones, who had been a student at Oberlin. And towards the end of her career, it was a few decades later, but she became Sacramento's first Black principal of an integrated school. St. Andrew's AME built this proud edifice on G and 7th Streets, currently the location of the Sacramento County Buildings parking structure, or the County Executive Building. There's a nice plaque, bronze plaque on the side. They mentioned Clarence Caesar. He actually used to have my job at the California Office of Historic Preservation. He was really the driving force between declaring that a California historical landmark, replacing at least a plaque there. So that reintroduction of African American history was something that he was one of the driving forces behind, and still is today. Salome Baptist Church, located at 6th and O Street, the base of what's now Capitol Towers, became the other second force in Sacramento, and both these two churches became really the lodestones around which the Black community organized. But there was another group, the Sacramento Zouaves, an independent Black company of armed soldiers. There were quite a few in California following the Civil War. There weren't any Black militias that participated in the Civil War from California, so far as I know. But after the war, they became very popular. There were several. There were the Lincoln Invincibles, the Brannon Guards, the Richmond Blues, and they all formed, along with the Zouaves, on June 10th, 1863 in San Francisco at the Athenaeum Hall. But they were not allowed to muster and join the Grand Army of the Republic, so they formed afterwards. Formally formed after the end of the war in Mr. William Gwynn's barbershop, securing the services of Captain Crowell, a U.S. Army veteran, later postmaster of Sacramento. This photo was taken by J. Asher of 244 J Street, and so far as I know, the only photo I've found anywhere of a Sacramento Zouave. Their first public event was 1868 in San Francisco. There was an effort to create a company. They were led by Captain Pearson, First Lieutenant William Galt, Second Lieutenant William Quinn. Again, that was the barbershop owner. Their drummer was Albert Grubbs Jr., and others mentioned were Barney Fletcher, Bill Goff, and Albert Grubbs Sr. And the Grubbs family name is one that appears again and again in the late 19th century and early 20th century African-American community. It's a fairly significant name that's worth researching. And they first marched in the Emancipation Celebration on January 1st, 1868, and presented with a silk flag by Lieutenant Galt's daughter. In 1872, they were made guests of the San Francisco Brannon Guards. The October 22nd, 1872 Daily Union mentions reception in Sacramento of General Ulysses S. Grant, and the Zouaves were in attendance, marching with other militia groups. And from the Daily Record Union of September 13th, 1880, the 1st Artillery Regiment arrived under escort of Sacramento Hussars, a German-American force led by Captain Frank Roostaller, and the Sacramento Zouaves, led by Captain Sin Emery, passing Governor Perkins' residence on 12th and 8th Street, then passed a review before Brigadier General Sheehan at 7th and X. The Zouaves rented the armory at 6th and M Street on December 10, 1874, and paid $10 in 1875 for its use on April 12th and July 1st. One member of the Zouaves that I'm going to have a little sneak peek. I'm going to talk more about Robert Fletcher in our next talk. But I did want to mention his early life because as a member of the Zouaves, he was unique, and he was one of the handful of Zouaves, so far as I know, who was actually a veteran of the Civil War. Now, Captain Robert Fletcher, I don't have a photo of him, but I have a photo of the ship he served on, so I've got that. He was born in New York around 1844. He was raised by his aunt on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas. Not sure whether or not, as I mentioned, that might have been one of the two islands where William Leidesdorff grew up. But during the Civil War, young Robert Fletcher learned that he was an American. He wasn't a native of St. Thomas. And at the time, he said, well, my country's at war, and it's to liberate my people. So I'm going to go back and fight. And he joined the United States Navy, serving aboard the Vanderbilt under Admiral Wilkes. He was a medical orderly, apparently. His travels after the war took him to Panama and the island of Tobago, where he worked in a British hospital, and an orderly trained him as a nurse. In 1869, Fletcher traveled to San Francisco and then Sacramento, where he married Emma Scott and became a member of the Zouaves. Judging by his performance in company-wide shooting contests, Fletcher was a skilled rifleman. For a portion of the 1870s, he lived in San Francisco, helping establish another black militia company, the Sumner Guard, before returning to Sacramento and taking the position of first sergeant in the Zouaves under Captain Emery and Lieutenant Isaiah Dunlap. If any of you ever heard of Dunlap's Dining Room? George Dunlap was the son of Isaiah Dunlap, the Sacramento Zouave. The Zouaves were more than a paramilitary organization. They also served a political purpose, encouraging black voting and civic participation. By 1879, Fletcher had succeeded Emery as captain of the Zouaves and led the procession that accompanied President Ulysses S. Grant in a grand parade down K Street during President Grant's visit to Sacramento in October of 1879. He was also active in the Republican Party from the 1870s through the 1900s, and a member of the Eureka Lodge, Philomathean Lodge, and the Odd Fellows. Talk more about him next time. But we're also going to talk about his second wife, because his first wife passed away, and he met a rather remarkable woman who got her start here in Sacramento. Anna Maida Hires on the right, Emma Louise Hires on the left, were members of a musical family. And Anna was born in Troy, New York. Emma here in Sacramento in 1857, 2 years after Anna. The Hires sisters were singers of extraordinary talent. Their first performance at the Metropolitan Theater in Sacramento in 1867, at the ages of 11 and 9, began a musical career that took them around the world. Managed by their father, Samuel Baltimore Hires, they traveled to Boston in 1872 to perform at the World Peace Jubilee, the first major musical production in the United States in which interracial performers shared a stage. 3 years later, they formed a theater company to produce their own musical dramas. These productions, including Out of Bondage and The Underground Railway, were first and foremost musical entertainment, but they also represented a reaction to the portrayal of African Americans in theater via the stereotypes of minstrel shows. The career of the Hires sisters spanned decades, but the sisters retired shortly before 1900. And again, I'm going to talk more about the Hires sisters next week, or next time. So here's the grand procession I mentioned, 1879. The Zouaves, in their full military regalia, marching with other Sacramento militia alongside the President of the United States. The future seemed bright and optimistic. The rights they'd fought so hard for were finally coming into their hands, and they felt that the future beyond this could only get better. Sadly, they were wrong, and we'll talk more about that next time. These are a few of the books that I've written. Sacramento's K Street has the most material that I've talked about today. I don't have an online store or anything, so I recommend a visit to Capital Books, capitalbooksonkay.com, or just visit them in person, 1011 K Street. And they should have signed copies. And if they don't, let them know to get in touch with me. If any of you want to buy a signed copy, they will have them. And the royalties from these books, just so you know, doesn't go to me. It goes to the Center for Sacramento History. They're the archive that provided most of the historic photos that I use in my books and presentations, and they're very worthy of your support. The only way I can support